Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. The forest was always quiet this time of year. That's why I liked it. I'd been working as a park ranger for about 8 years now, mainly out here in the thick woods of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. The visitors were few and far between, and that suited me just fine. I wasn't one for small talk or chit-chat. The solitude was why I took this job in the first place. My name's Ethan McAllister, and my path to becoming a ranger wasn't exactly straightforward. Before this gig, I spent 7 grueling years working construction in Tulsa. Those years took their toll. Too many late nights bent over blueprints, too many angry bosses breathing down my neck, too many beers to chase away the frustration. The work itself wasn't bad, but the lifestyle was killing me slowly. My doctor had started throwing around words like pre-hypertensive and stress-related symptoms. I needed a change. The ranger position came up almost by accident. I was browsing job listings one night, 3 beers deep, when I saw the posting. They wanted someone with experience in maintaining structures, dealing with harsh weather conditions, and working independently. Construction had taught me all that and more. I applied without much hope, but 2 weeks later I was trading in my hard hat for a ranger's uniform. That was 8 years ago. The job gave me peace, at least until recently. The events I'm about to describe happened just last month, and I've spent every day since then questioning everything I thought I knew about these woods and the creatures that call them home. The morning started like any other. My shift began at dawn, temperature hovering around 45 degrees with a hint of fog rolling through the valleys. I grabbed my gear, standard issue radio, first aid kit, GPS unit, and the .45 I'd been carrying since day one. Some of the newer rangers gave me grief about the gun, said it was overkill for park duty, but I'd seen enough in these woods to know better. Black bears, mountain lions, the occasional rabid coyote. Sometimes you need more stopping power than a can of pepper spray. The air was crisp, almost sharp in my lungs as I started my rounds. The dampness of the morning dew clung to my boots, leaving dark prints on the trail behind me. I headed toward my favorite section of the park, a secluded area known as Pine Hollow. It was remote enough that we rarely saw visitors there, which made it perfect for wildlife observation. The thick canopy of old-growth pines created a permanent twilight beneath their branches, and normally, the place was teeming with life. But not that morning. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. In 8 years of ranger work, I'd learned to read the forest like a book. Every sound, every movement told a story. That morning the story was wrong. No birds calling their morning songs, no squirrels chattering in the branches. Even the insects seemed quieter than usual. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. After all, there could be natural explanations. A predator passing through could silence the woodland creatures. But as I approached the old fire pit, a spot that hadn't seen use in months, the wrongness intensified. The ground around the pit was torn up, but not in any way I'd seen before. Deep gouges raked through the soil, too large for a bear, too deliberate for normal animal behavior. The marks were fresh, probably from the night before, and they formed an almost circular pattern around the pit. But it was the depth that troubled me most. Whatever had made these marks had incredible strength. The gouges were nearly 8 inches deep in places, cutting through roots as thick as my wrist. The trees told an even more disturbing story. Massive claw marks scored the bark, some as high as 12 feet up the trunk. I'd seen bear markings before, hell, I'd documented hundreds of them over the years. These were different. The spacing was wrong, too wide for any animal native to these mountains. And the pattern, bears marked trees in vertical strips. These marks curved and intersected, almost like something had been trying to climb the trees sideways. I crouched down to examine one of the lower marks, pulling out my phone to document the damage. The photos would be important later, though at the time I was just following protocol. As I framed the shot, a sharp crack echoed through the trees to my left, like a thick branch snapping under considerable weight. My hand moved to the .45 before my conscious mind caught up. 15 years of construction work and 8 years as a ranger had taught me to trust my instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. I moved toward the sound, keeping low and stepping carefully to minimize noise. The forest floor was damp enough to muffle my footsteps, but the undergrowth was dense here. Every few steps, a twig would crack or leaves would rustle, sounds that seemed deafening in the unnatural silence. The first glimpse I caught of the creature was just a blur of movement through the trees. Something big, much bigger than a bear, moving with a speed that didn't match its size. The motion was fluid but wrong somehow, like watching a film played at slightly the wrong speed. I followed, keeping my distance, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. When I reached a small clearing, I finally got a clear view, and my world shifted on its axis. The creature stood at the far edge of the clearing, its back toward me. Even hunched over, it had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, coarse fur that seemed to shift between dark brown and gray depending on how the filtered sunlight hit it. But it wasn't the size or the fur that made my blood run cold. It was the way it was put together. The proportions were all wrong, like someone had taken parts from different animals and forced them together without understanding how bodies are supposed to work. Its limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. The back legs bent like a wolf's, but with an extra joint halfway up the thigh. Its arms, if you could call them that, hung almost to the ground, ending in massive paws with claws that looked more like black daggers than natural appendages. I had my .45 drawn, but I didn't fire. 8 years of ranger training kicked in. You don't shoot unless you're absolutely certain of your target and what's beyond it. But more than that, some primal part of my brain was afraid that bullets wouldn't be enough. That shooting would just make it angry. Then it turned around. I've spent weeks trying to find the right words to describe what I saw, but language fails me. The closest I can come is to say it had a face like a nightmare's interpretation of a wolf. The snout was too long, too wide, filled with yellowed teeth that didn't fit together properly. Some curved outward over its lips, others seemed to grow at random angles. But it was the eyes that haunted me. Pitch black and somehow intelligent, with none of the animal vacancy you see in a wolf or bear. These eyes knew things. They recognized me not as prey or predator, but as something else entirely. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the clearing. My finger rested on the trigger, but I couldn't make myself squeeze it. The creature's head tilted slightly, almost curiously, and then it moved. The speed was impossible. One moment it was across the clearing, the next it was gone, vanishing into the trees to my right with a fluidity that defied physics. The movement left me disoriented, my brain struggling to process what I'd just seen. But then I heard the scream. It was human, high-pitched and terrified, coming from the direction the creature had gone. Training took over, and I ran toward the sound, pushing through branches and undergrowth, no longer caring about the noise I made. I came upon another clearing, this one smaller, and immediately wished I hadn't. A young couple, probably college students, stood frozen in horror, staring at what remained of their friend. The victim, male, maybe early 20s, lay sprawled on the ground between them. His chest cavity had been torn open with surgical precision, ribs splayed outward like the petals of some grotesque flower. Internal organs lay scattered across the forest floor, some still connected by strands of tissue, others completely separated from the body. The couple noticed me and ran over, the girl crying hysterically, the guy trying to form coherent sentences through his shock. I positioned myself between them and their friend's body, my gun still drawn, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The girl managed to choke out that they'd been camping, illegally, in an undesignated area, when the thing had attacked without warning. I was about to radio for backup when I heard it, a deep rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The noise was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite a growl, not quite a hiss, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The creature emerged from the shadows with that same impossible speed, but this time it didn't run. It stood at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those terrible intelligent eyes. Blood matted the fur around its mouth, and pieces of flesh clung to its claws. The couple behind me whimpered, and I could feel them pressing closer to my back. What happened next took maybe 5 seconds, but I'll remember it for the rest of my life. The creature charged, moving in that fluid, raw way that defied natural movement. I fired 3 times, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The first 2 bullets hit it in the chest, punching through fur and flesh. The third caught it in the head, just below one of those black eyes. The creature stumbled, its charge interrupted, but it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed confused, like it couldn't understand what had happened. Dark blood oozed from the wounds, but it was too thick, too dark to be normal blood. The thing swayed on its feet, those wrong joints bending in impossible ways as it tried to maintain balance. Then finally, it collapsed. The impact when it hit the ground shook leaves from the nearby trees. We all stood there, frozen, waiting to see if it would get up again. It didn't. The only movement was a slight twitching of its limbs, and even that stopped after a few minutes. I kept my gun trained on it while I called for backup on my radio. Within 20 minutes, the clearing was swarming with park rangers and local law enforcement. The sheriff himself showed up, took one look at the creature, and went white as a sheet. I gave my statement 3 times to 3 different people, each time sticking to the facts, leaving out my more subjective observations about the intelligence in its eyes or the wrongness of its movement. The couple was escorted back to the ranger station for their own statements. The girl couldn't stop crying, and the guy looked like he'd aged 10 years in the space of an hour. I never saw them again after that day, but I sometimes wonder how they're coping with what they saw. As for the creature's body, it was loaded into an unmarked van by people who showed up in dark suits and refused to identify themselves beyond vague mentions of a research facility. Before they took it away, I got one last look at it in the daylight. Something about it seemed different in death. Less wrong somehow, as if whatever had animated it and made it so unnatural had fled when it died. The official report lists the incident as an animal attack, probably a bear, with the actual creature's body being classified as an unknown species requiring further study. The victim's death was ruled as a wildlife-related fatality, and the case was closed. But I know what I saw. I still work these woods, but things are different now. I carry extra ammunition. I don't patrol alone if I can help it. And I pay attention to the silence, because sometimes, late at night when I'm making my rounds, I hear that rattling sound in the distance, and I wonder if what I killed that day was the only one of its kind. The forest is quiet this time of year, maybe too quiet. I've always been a city person. The constant hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the comforting anonymity of urban life. These were the things I knew and loved. But a few times a year, I'd feel this inexplicable urge to get away from it all. Not your typical beach vacation or resort getaway, mind you. I'm talking about disappearing into the wilderness, finding some secluded cabin rental, and spending a week completely off the grid. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if those trips were some kind of twisted fate. Was I unknowingly drawn to something out there in the dark, or was it drawn to me? These questions have haunted me ever since that fateful week in the Ozarks, a trip that would forever change my perception of reality and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was late October, about 3 years ago. I had just wrapped up a grueling project at work, and the need to escape was stronger than ever. I spent hours poring over rental listings, searching for something truly remote. That's when I stumbled upon it. A converted fire tower deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, right in the heart of Missouri's Ozark Mountains. The listing promised complete solitude, a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness, and absolutely no modern amenities beyond the bare essentials. It was perfect. I booked it immediately, requested time off work, and started planning my trip with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. The drive from St. Louis took nearly 4 hours, the last hour of which was on winding back roads that seemed to get narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. My phone lost signal about 45 minutes before I reached my destination, and I found myself relying solely on the printed directions the owner had provided. As I navigated the final stretch of gravel road, the dense forest suddenly gave way to a small clearing, and there it was, my home for the next week. The fire tower stood about 60 feet tall, a weathered wooden structure that looked like it had been there for decades. A narrow staircase zigzagged up its side, leading to a small cabin perched at the top. I parked my car and took a moment to stretch, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The silence was almost overwhelming after hours of highway noise. No cars, no planes overhead, not even the distant bark of a dog. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird I couldn't identify. Grabbing my backpack and a couple of supply boxes, I made my way up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and I found myself gripping the railing a little tighter as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were burning, and I was slightly out of breath. Note to self: city life hasn't been kind to my fitness level. The cabin itself was simple but cozy. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, complete with a propane stove and a cooler that served as a makeshift refrigerator. A narrow bed was tucked against the opposite wall, and a rickety table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. But the real star of the show was the view. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire cabin, offering an unobstructed panorama of the surrounding Ozark wilderness. Rolling hills covered in a patchwork of autumn colors stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, I could make out the silvery ribbon of a river winding its way through the valley. As I unpacked and settled in, I felt the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. This was exactly what I needed. No emails, no phone calls, no deadlines. Just me, my books, and the great outdoors. The sun was setting by the time I finished organizing my supplies. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and stepped out onto the small balcony that wrapped around the cabin. The view was, in a word, breathtaking. The fading sunlight painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the landscape below. But as I stood there, taking in the beauty of it all, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of unease. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the natural apprehension of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Yet as the light continued to fade and the shadows deepened, the feeling only intensified. It was a sensation I'd never experienced before. A heaviness in the air, a prickling at the back of my neck. I felt watched. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for this irrational fear that was slowly taking hold. But there was nothing, just the gentle swaying of branches in the evening breeze. I shook my head, trying to clear these thoughts. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "You're just not used to being this isolated. It's perfectly normal to feel a little on edge." Forcing myself to relax, I finished my beer and headed back inside. I heated up a simple dinner of canned soup and settled in with one of the books I'd brought along. But even as I tried to lose myself in the pages, I couldn't help glancing up at the windows every few minutes, peering into the darkness beyond. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the tower in the wind, every rustle from the forest below had me jolting awake. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shapeless shadows and glowing eyes watching me from just beyond the firelight. I awoke the next morning feeling groggy and unrested. The early morning sun was streaming through the windows, and I could hear birds chirping cheerfully outside. In the light of day, my fears from the previous evening seemed silly and overblown. I chalked it up to first-night jitters and resolved to make the most of my day. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I decided to explore the area around the tower. There was a trail map pinned to the wall, showing a network of hiking paths crisscrossing the surrounding hills. One trail in particular caught my eye. It led to the top of a nearby ridge that promised even more spectacular views of the valley. I packed a small day pack with water, some snacks, and a first aid kit. As an afterthought, I also grabbed the can of bear spray I'd brought along. Better safe than sorry, right? With one last glance at the map, I headed down the tower stairs and set off into the woods. The trail started off easy enough, winding through stands of oak and hickory trees. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, creating a satisfying crunch beneath my boots with each step. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying vegetation, that distinct autumn smell that always filled me with a sense of nostalgia. As I hiked, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the trail. The paranoia from the night before faded away, replaced by a growing appreciation for the natural beauty surrounding me. I stopped occasionally to examine interesting plants or rock formations, snapping photos with my camera to document the journey. It was during one of these stops, about an hour into my hike, that I first noticed something off. I had paused to retie my bootlace when a flash of movement caught my eye. It was just at the edge of my peripheral vision, gone almost as soon as I registered it. I straightened up quickly, scanning the trees around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Probably just a deer, I murmured, trying to convince myself. But the uneasy feeling from the night before had returned, settling like a cold weight in my stomach. I pressed on, but now I found myself hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every snapping twig or rustling bush had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to notice other things. There were broken branches along the trail, snapped at a height that seemed too tall for a deer. In a few places, I spotted tufts of coarse, dark fur caught on thorny bushes. And then there was the smell. A musky animal odor that reminded me of a poorly maintained zoo enclosure. It would hit me in waves, growing stronger in some areas before fading away again. By the time I reached the base of the final climb to the ridge, my nerves were thoroughly frayed. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything I'd seen and smelled. But another part, a more primal instinct, was screaming at me to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible. I stood there for several long moments, debating whether to continue or head back to the relative safety of the fire tower. In the end, stubbornness won out. I'd come this far, and I was determined to see the view from the top of the ridge. Besides, whatever was out here, if there even was anything, surely wouldn't approach me in broad daylight, right? The final ascent was steep and challenging, requiring me to scramble over boulders and pull myself up using exposed tree roots in some places. By the time I reached the summit, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my legs were trembling from exertion. But oh, that view. It was even more spectacular than I had imagined. From this vantage point, I could see for miles in every direction. The Ozark Mountains rolled away to the horizon, a sea of reds, oranges, and golds, punctuated by the occasional evergreen. Far below, I could make out the glint of sunlight on water, probably the same river I'd spotted from the fire tower. I found a flat rock to sit on and pulled out my water bottle and a granola bar. As I sat there, catching my breath and taking in the breathtaking scenery, I felt my earlier fears begin to dissipate. How could I be afraid in a place of such incredible beauty? But then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape moving in the valley far below, barely distinguishable from the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun. I might not have even noticed it if not for the way it moved, in a bounding, loping gait that was unlike any animal I'd ever seen. I fumbled for my camera, zooming in as far as the lens would allow. Through the viewfinder, I could make out more details, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. The creature was massive, easily the size of a bear, but its proportions were all wrong. It seemed to shift between moving on all fours and rising up on two legs, its movements fluid and unnaturally quick for something of its size. As I watched, frozen in a mix of fascination and terror, the creature paused. And then, with a deliberate slowness that made my blood run cold, it turned its head and looked directly up at me. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes, two pinpricks of reflected light that seemed to bore into my very soul. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this thing, whatever it was aware of me, had been aware of me perhaps since the moment I'd entered its territory. The spell was broken by the sound of my camera clattering to the ground. I hadn't even realized I'd dropped it. That small noise was enough to snap me back to reality, and suddenly, the only thought in my mind was escape. I scrambled to my feet, leaving my backpack and camera behind in my haste. The sun was now dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. How long had I been sitting there, transfixed by that thing? I'd lost all track of time, and now I was facing a treacherous descent in rapidly fading light. I half ran, half slid down the steep trail, my hands and knees getting scraped and bruised as I stumbled over rocks and roots. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me convinced that the creature was right behind me, ready to pounce at any moment. About halfway down, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that bypassed all rational thought and struck directly at the most primitive part of my brain. "Run," it said. "Run or die." I don't remember much of the rest of that descent. It's all a blur of panic and adrenaline, of branches whipping at my face, and the constant, overwhelming certainty that I was being pursued. At some point, I veered off the main trail, crashing blindly through the underbrush in what I hoped was the general direction of the fire tower. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a small clearing. There, looming out of the gathering darkness, was an old shed. Without a second thought, I yanked open the weathered door and threw myself inside, pulling it shut behind me. The interior of the shed was pitch black and smelled of mold and decay. I huddled in a corner, trying to quiet my ragged breathing as I strained to listen for any sound of pursuit. Minutes ticked by, then hours. The temperature dropped, and I began to shiver uncontrollably, both from cold and residual fear. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the cracks in the shed's walls. My whole body ached and my mouth was parched with thirst. But I was alive. With trembling hands, I eased the shed door open and peered outside. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror from the night before. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I oriented myself using the position of the sun, then set off at a brisk pace in what I hoped was the direction of the fire tower. It took nearly 2 hours of walking before I finally spotted the familiar silhouette of the tower through the trees. I've never been so relieved to see anything in my life. I practically ran the last 100 yards, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite my exhaustion. Once inside, I locked the door, pulled down all the blinds, and collapsed onto the bed. I wanted nothing more than to sleep for days, to pretend that none of this had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there in those woods, it knew where I was, and I had no intention of being here when night fell again. I packed my belongings in record time, leaving behind anything non-essential to speed up my departure. As I was doing a final sweep of the cabin, my eyes fell on the trail map pinned to the wall. On an impulse, I tore it down and stuffed it into my pocket. I'm not sure why. Maybe as proof that this place was real, that I hadn't imagined it all. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I didn't truly relax until I saw the Welcome to St. Louis sign, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me, awareness of something that I was never meant to know existed. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, I told myself, or some kind of large wolf. The human mind can play tricks, especially in unfamiliar and stressful situations. But deep down, I knew these explanations were lies I was telling myself to maintain my sanity. I couldn't resist the urge to dig deeper. I spent hours online searching for any information about strange sightings or encounters in the Ozarks. Most of what I found was clearly exaggerated folklore or outright hoaxes. But buried in old newspaper archives and obscure forums, I started to see a pattern. There were reports, stretching back decades, of hikers and campers going missing in that area. Most were written off as tragic accidents, people getting lost or falling victim to the harsh terrain. But some accounts mentioned strange noises in the night, unexplained tracks, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. One story in particular caught my attention. It was from a local paper, dated just a few weeks after my own encounter. A body had been found in the woods, not far from where I'd stayed. The article was light on details, but it mentioned that the victim had been torn to shreds by an unknown animal. The authorities were baffled, saying the wounds didn't match any known predator in the area. As I read account after account, a name kept coming up in hushed whispers and cautious speculation: the Ozark Howler. According to local legend, it was some kind of wolf-like creature that had been haunting the hills for generations. Most dismissed it as a campfire story, a way to explain the inexplicable sounds and sights of the deep woods. But I knew better. What I'd seen was no legend, no trick of the light or overactive imagination. It was real, and it was still out there. I tried to put it all behind me, to go back to my normal life. For a while it seemed to work. I threw myself into my job, started going out more, doing anything to keep my mind occupied. But the memories of that night in the Ozark KS never truly faded. They lingered at the edges of my consciousness, creeping into my dreams and coloring my perception of the world around me. Months passed, and I started to feel like I was finally regaining some semblance of normalcy. I still avoided camping or hiking, but I could at least walk through the park without constantly looking over my shoulder. I even started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had blown the whole incident out of proportion. That illusion of safety was shattered one crisp autumn night, almost exactly a year after my encounter in the Ozarks. I was working late, the office long since emptied of my co-workers. As I gathered my things to leave, I glanced out the window of my 10th floor office. The city sprawled out below, a sea of twinkling lights and shadowy skyscrapers. It was a view I'd seen 1,000 times before, but something about it made me pause. There, on the roof of the building across the street, was a dark shape. At first, I thought it might be a maintenance worker, or perhaps some equipment I'd never noticed before. But then it moved. My blood ran cold as I watched the creature lope across the rooftop with that same unnatural gait I remembered from the forest. It paused at the edge of the building, and even from this distance, I could see the gleam of its eyes as it turned to look directly at me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in the middle of the city. I was safe here, wasn't I? With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. But what could I say? That I'd seen a monster on a rooftop? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. I ended the call before it connected and instead snapped a quick picture through the window. The image was blurry and dark, but I could just make out a vague shape on the distant rooftop. I practically ran to my car, constantly checking over my shoulder. The drive home was a nightmare of paranoia, every shadow and movement in my periphery setting my nerves on edge. Once home, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and huddled on my couch with all the lights on. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night researching, trying to find any explanation for what I'd seen. That's when I stumbled upon an obscure cryptozoology forum. Most of the posts were the usual Bigfoot and Loch Ness monster theories, but buried in the archives was a thread about the Ozark Howler. As I read through the accounts, my blood ran cold. Several people claimed to have encountered the creature far from its usual hunting grounds. There were reports from Kansas City, from Chicago, even one from as far as Detroit. All described the same thing, a large wolf-like creature spotted in urban areas, always at night, always watching. One post in particular caught my attention. The user, who went by the handle Ozark Survivor, claimed to have had an encounter similar to mine. They too had seen the creature first in the woods, then later in their home city. But their story didn't end there. According to Ozark Survivor, the creature had continued to stalk them. It would appear sporadically, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes on distant rooftops, sometimes in shadowy alleys, once even on the balcony of their high-rise apartment. The post ended abruptly, with no further updates from the user. As dawn broke, I was still on the forum, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. The rational part of my brain insisted that it was all nonsense, just urban legends and overactive imaginations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth hidden in these stories. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with researching the Ozark Howler and similar cryptid sightings. I started carrying a high-quality camera with me everywhere, hoping to capture proof if I saw the creature again. I installed security cameras around my apartment and found myself checking the footage compulsively. My work began to suffer. I was constantly exhausted, jumping at every shadow. Friends started to comment on my appearance, asking if everything was okay. I brushed off their concerns, unable to explain the terror that had taken over my life. Then, about a month after the rooftop sighting, it happened again. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I'd hoped never to hear again. That low, rumbling growl that bypassed all rational thought and struck terror into the deepest part of my being. With a trembling hand, I reached for the bedside lamp. As light flooded the room, I saw it. There, on my 10th floor balcony, was the creature. It was pressed against the glass door, its massive form blocking out the city lights behind it. I could see it clearly now, in a way I never had before. Its body was a mass of corded muscle covered in thick, dark fur. Its head was wolf-like, but the proportions were all wrong. The snout too long, the eyes too intelligent. Those eyes, they stared at me with an awareness that was terrifyingly human. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I was frozen in my bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature just watched me, its hot breath fogging the glass. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive paw and placed it against the balcony door. The glass creaked under the pressure, and I saw hairline cracks begin to spread from beneath its claws. That was enough to break me from my paralysis. I lunged for my phone, fumbling to unlock it and open the camera app. But by the time I looked back up, the balcony was empty. The creature had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only the cracked glass and a lingering sense of dread. The photo I managed to take showed nothing but an empty balcony. The only evidence of my encounter was the damaged door, and even that could be explained away by natural causes. A stress fracture in the glass, perhaps, or damage from a hailstorm I didn't remember. In the days that followed, I barely slept. I spent my nights huddled in my living room, all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the building settling. During the day, I wandered through life in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The creature, whatever it was, had followed me home. It knew where I lived, and it was toying with me. Each appearance felt like a message. You can't escape. I'm always watching. In desperation, I reached out to Ozark Survivor through the forum. To my surprise, I received a response almost immediately. The message was brief, but it chilled me to my core. It won't stop. It never stops. The only way out is to go back, face it where it all began. I knew what I had to do. A week later, I found myself driving back into the Ozarks. I had taken a leave of absence from work, citing mental health reasons. It wasn't far from the truth. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. This time I came prepared. I had camping gear, emergency supplies, and a high-powered rifle I'd purchased specifically for this trip. I didn't know if it would be effective against the creature, but it made me feel a little less helpless. I set up camp near the fire tower where my nightmare had begun a year ago. As night fell, I built a large fire and waited. Part of me hoped that nothing would happen, that I'd spend a quiet night in the woods and return home, writing off my experiences as an extended, stress-induced hallucination. But as the moon rose over the trees, I heard it. That familiar growl, closer than ever before. I gripped my rifle tightly, my palms sweaty despite the cool night air. It emerged from the shadows at the edge of my campsite. In the flickering firelight, it looked even more terrifying than I remembered. Its eyes reflected the flames, giving them a hellish glow. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could feel its gaze boring into me, filled with an intelligence that seemed impossible for a mere animal. Slowly, I raised my rifle. The creature didn't move. It just watched me, almost seeming curious. And in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. It wasn't hunting me. It never had been. This creature, this impossibility, was studying me. Just as I had been fascinated by it, venturing into its territory out of a desire to unplug and experience something beyond my normal life, it had become fascinated by me. It had followed me back to the city not out of malice, but out of a desire to understand. I lowered my rifle, my hands shaking. "What are you?" I whispered. The creature tilted its head almost quizzically. Then, to my utter astonishment, it sat back on its haunches, much like a dog might. But the intelligence in its eyes was anything but canine. Slowly, cautiously, I sank down to sit by my fire. The creature remained where it was, just watching. And so we stayed, human and monster, regarding each other across the flames. I'd like to say that this realization solved everything, that the creature and I came to some sort of understanding, that my fear vanished and was replaced by wonder. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I spent that entire night in a state of hyper-alertness, my hand never far from my rifle. When dawn finally broke, the creature slunk back into the forest, leaving me alone and exhausted. I packed up my camp with shaking hands and drove home. In the days and weeks that followed, I grappled with what had happened. I never saw the creature in the city again, but I could never shake the feeling of being watched. I've spent the years since then trying to understand what happened to me. I've reached out to cryptozoologists, to folklorists, even to a few open-minded biologists. Most dismiss my story outright. A few listen with interest, but can offer no explanations. I've returned to the Ozarks a few times since then. I never see the creature directly, but sometimes, in the deepest parts of the night, I hear that growl in the distance. And I know it's out there, watching, learning. I don't know what the Ozark howler is. An undiscovered species? Some kind of paranormal entity? A government experiment gone wrong? I have theories, but no real answers. What I do know is this. There are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk at the edges of our reality, challenging everything we think we know about the natural world. And sometimes, when we venture into the wilderness seeking to unplug from our modern lives, we attract the attention of these things. So the next time you're in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, well, maybe you are. And maybe, just maybe, the watcher is as curious about you as you are about it. Just be careful. Not all curiosity is benign, and some things once seen can never be unseen. My name is Thomas Wilson. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in September 2001. I've never spoken of this before, and I don't consider myself a storyteller, but I have a feeling you won't believe me anyway, so here goes. I work for a clandestine government organization that specializes in hunting monsters. You won't find any information about us online, and that's by design. If word of our existence ever got out, well, let's just say you might find some men in black suits knocking on your door at midnight. Our team has a code name, Shadow Hunters. I'm the reconnaissance specialist. My job is to scout, analyze, and report back. We were summoned to a national forest in Oregon after a series of unexplained disappearances. At first glance, it seemed like a routine missing persons case. Hikers and campers vanishing without a trace. No bodies, no evidence. The locals blamed it on bears and mountain lions, which made sense on the surface. But the frequency of the disappearances over such a short period raised red flags. Then came the disturbing evidence that pushed this case into our territory. Photographs surfaced, blurry but unmistakable. They showed a massive dark figure hunched over what was clearly not a pile of leaves. The entity was humanoid but impossibly tall, towering over any professional basketball player, with a build that suggested immense strength. Those photos were what brought us in. We arrived at the forest under the cover of darkness. Our team consisted of 4 members. Rodriguez, our muscle and a bit of a hothead. Chen, our tech expert and the brains of the operation. Dr. Patel, our medic and probably the only reason I'm alive to tell this tale. And myself, Thomas Wilson, the eyes and ears of the team. We set up our base camp near a secluded trailhead. The night was unnaturally warm, even for late summer. There was an eerie stillness in the air that set my nerves on edge. We took turns keeping watch, 2 on duty while the other 2 rested. Dr. Patel and I took the first shift. Hours passed uneventfully, with only the usual forest sounds breaking the silence. Around 2 a.m. we handed off to Chen and Rodriguez. I had just drifted off to sleep when a blood-curdling scream jolted me awake. It was Rodriguez, his voice filled with raw terror. I grabbed my rifle, Dr. Patel right beside me. We burst out of the tent to find Chen missing. His sleeping bag was torn open, a single drag mark in the dirt leading into the dense undergrowth. A low primal growl echoed from the darkness. It wasn't a sound I recognized from any known animal. Dr. Patel raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line. For a split second, we saw them, 2 massive reflective eyes staring back at us. "Dear God," Dr. Patel whispered. It was just a glimpse before the thing retreated into the shadows, but its outline was all wrong. The arms and legs were too long, its gait a loping stride that spoke of unnatural power and speed. Rodriguez was still screaming Chen's name, his voice growing hoarse. We pulled him back towards the tent, trying to regroup. "We have to go after him," Rodriguez snarled, shaking us off. "No," I said firmly. "We call this in and wait for backup." "And let that thing pick us off one by one?" Rodriguez shouted. He had a point, but I wasn't about to throw our lives away on a suicide mission. I grabbed the radio, but all we got was static. Our equipment was jammed somehow. "It knows," Dr. Patel said, his eyes wide with realization. He wasn't wrong. As daybreak painted the forest in sickly hues, we felt exposed and vulnerable. We decided to head back to the main road, hoping to reach higher ground where we might catch a signal. We didn't make it far. There was a clearing just at the edge of the tree line. In its center, Chen hung suspended 10 feet off the ground, impaled through the chest on a massive wooden spike jutting from the earth. It was fresh wood, as if a tree had been ripped out, sharpened, and I turned away, bile rising in my throat. Dr. Patel knelt, hands shaking as he reached for his medkit, though we all knew it was futile. Rodriguez was silent, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "I'm going to kill it," he growled through clenched teeth. We tried to navigate around the clearing, but every path seemed to lead back to its center, as if the forest itself was guiding us towards that grotesque display. The air grew heavier, oppressive. A loud snap echoed through the trees. We spun in circles, rifles raised, adrenaline pounding in our ears. Then a massive shape fell from the canopy, landing between us and the clearing. It was the creature from the night before, in all its terrible glory. A towering giant at least 9 feet tall. It was gaunt and starved-looking, with skin stretched tight over bone. Its face was elongated, almost like a dog's muzzle, filled with razor-sharp fangs. Long clawed arms hung nearly to its knees. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and opened fire. The bullet slammed into the creature, making it jerk with each impact, but it kept coming. Dr. Patel grabbed my arm and pulled me back. We ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at our faces, the sounds of the creature's relentless pursuit right behind us. Bursts of gunfire from Rodriguez echoed, growing fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. Dr. Patel tripped, and I crashed down with him, tumbling into a ditch. I rolled underneath a tangle of roots and vines, dragging him with me. Silence fell around us. Not the peaceful silence of the forest, but the heavy, watchful silence of a predator. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. "Dr. Patel?" I hissed. A faint groan came from beside me. Relief flooded through me, quickly replaced by guilt. We had abandoned Rodriguez. There was no way he could have survived that encounter. We had to keep moving. I pressed my ear to the ground, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had lost our scent. We spent hours crawling and weaving through the dense undergrowth. The forest felt like it was closing in on us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Finally, we came across a dirt road, the first sign of civilization we had seen in what felt like an eternity. We followed it, hoping it would lead us out of this nightmare. We didn't speak. The weight of Rodriguez's death hung heavy between us. A noise up ahead made my hand tighten on my rifle. Relief washed over me when I saw the headlights of a truck approaching. It slowed as it drew closer, the driver peering out with a puzzled expression. "Hey, fellas," he called, suspicion evident in his voice. "Y'all lost?" We must have been a sight, covered in dirt and scratches, our eyes wild with exhaustion and terror. I managed to explain about the creature, stumbling over the words. It sounded insane even to my own ears. The driver's expression shifted to one of amusement. "Now, I've heard some tall tales in these parts, but that one takes the cake. Bigfoot, aliens, what'll it be next?" It was futile. No one was going to believe us. I thanked him for the ride back into town and refused to answer any more questions. The local sheriff gave us similar treatment, concern mixed with thinly veiled mockery. They thought we were just lost hikers, maybe a little rattled after a cougar scare. Back at headquarters, the debriefing went as expected. Skeptical faces, raised eyebrows. Disbelief hung heavy in the air. We were ordered to take 2 weeks of leave, with mandatory psychological evaluations scheduled. We were branded as the crazy ones, the agents who saw things that didn't exist. We never saw the creature again, but I could feel it, lurking in the shadows of my mind. It had hunted us, played with us, and it could strike again any time, anywhere. It knew who we were. It knew where to find us. For Dr. Patel, the damage was worse than any physical wounds. The nightmares stole his sleep. Whispers from the darkness filled his waking hours. He couldn't shake the image of Chen, the feeling of helplessness of being trapped. They said it was PTSD, but I knew it was something more. A year later, Dr. Patel took his own life. They cleaned out his locker, sent the standard condolences to his next of kin. Life at the base moved on as if he'd never existed. I'm still with the team 10 years later. We hunt the things the rest of the world doesn't believe in, the things the government knows damn well are real, even if they'll never admit it publicly. And every night when I close my eyes, I see that clearing. Chen hanging lifeless, Rodriguez's roar of defiance, and the creature's unblinking eyes staring out at us from the darkness. Rodriguez had been right. We were hunted, marked. Survivors? No. We were the living dead. Our lives reduced to a countdown to the next encounter with the unknown. And the nightmares? They never really end. You just learn to live with them, constant companions reminding you that the darkness is vast, and the monsters lurking within are very real. Sometimes I wonder if they put us on leave on purpose back then. Did they already know about the creature's tendencies? Were we an experiment all along? A test to see how long we would last? How much we could endure before we broke? Those thoughts are the most terrifying of all. They hint at a truth far more disturbing than any monster lurking in the woods. That the shadows we fight might just be a part of us, a darkness cultivated and unleashed by the very organization sworn to protect humanity. As I sit here, an old man now, I can't help but feel that my time is running out. The creature is patient, but it never forgets. One day, it will come for me, as it came for Chen and Rodriguez. And when it does, will anyone believe my story? Or will I simply become another mysterious disappearance, another tale whispered around campfires? Remember this, dear reader. The forests hold secrets darker than you can imagine. And sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones who send us to face them, knowing full well what awaits in the dark. As the miles rolled by and the forest receded behind us, I found myself wondering if I would ever truly escape what I'd experienced in those woods. The old man driving the car, who had introduced himself as Frank, kept glancing at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You want to tell me what happened back there, son?" he asked after we'd been driving for about 20 minutes. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, and I'd lived through it. I was staying at a cabin in the woods, I began hesitantly. Things started happening. Strange things. I heard noises, saw things that shouldn't exist. And then tonight, I thought I heard my cousin calling for help, but it wasn't him. It was something else. I expected Frank to laugh, to tell me I must have been dreaming or hallucinating. But he just nodded slowly, his weathered face grave in the dim light of the dashboard. "Pisgah's got its secrets," he said after a long pause. "Been living in these parts all my life, and there's things in those woods that don't fit into any natural history book, if you know what I mean." A chill ran down my spine. "You've seen something too?" Frank shook his head. "Not me personally. But I've heard stories. Folks going missing, strange lights in the sky, animals acting peculiar. Most people write it off as tall tales or superstition, but you've got the look of a man who's seen something he can't explain away." We lapsed into silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. As the adrenaline of my escape began to wear off, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Frank was gently shaking my shoulder. "We're here, son," he said. I blinked, disoriented. We were parked outside a small diner, its neon sign a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Brevard," Frank replied. "Figured you could use some food and coffee, and there's a motel down the street if you need a place to stay." I nodded gratefully, realizing for the first time how hungry and thirsty I was. As we entered the diner, the smell of coffee and bacon wrapping around me like a comforting blanket, I felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. I was safe. I was back in the world of fluorescent lights and Formica tabletops, of tired waitresses and truckers on their early morning routes. As we settled into a booth and placed our orders, Frank leaned across the table, his expression serious. "Listen, son," he said in a low voice. "I don't know exactly what you saw out there, and I'm not sure I want to. But let me give you some advice. There's folks around here who've had experiences. They meet up sometimes, talk about what they've seen. Helps to know you're not alone, you know." He scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across to me. "They're meeting tonight, if you're interested." I stared at the napkin, conflicting emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted nothing more than to forget everything that had happened, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, and too many nights alone in the woods. But another part of me knew that I'd never be able to forget, never be able to fully convince myself that it hadn't been real. "Thanks," I said, pocketing the napkin. "I'll think about it." After breakfast, Frank dropped me off at the motel. As I watched his taillights disappear down the street, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this kind stranger who had quite possibly saved my life. In my motel room, I finally allowed myself to relax. I took a long, hot shower, scrubbing away the dirt and sweat of my ordeal. As I dried off, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and hardly recognized the haggard, wild-eyed man staring back at me. I spent most of the day sleeping, my body desperately catching up on days of stress and sleepless nights. When I woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. I sat on the edge of the bed, Frank's napkin in my hand, debating what to do next. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I needed answers, or at least the comfort of knowing I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address Frank had provided. The meeting was held in the back room of a local community center. As I walked in, I was struck by how ordinary everyone looked. There were maybe 24 people of various ages, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups and chatting in low voices. They could have been a book club or a neighborhood watch meeting. But as the meeting got underway and people began to share their stories, I realized I was among kindred spirits. They spoke of strange lights in the sky, of lost time and inexplicable phenomena, and some like me had encountered things in the depths of Pisgah that defied explanation. I listened, my heart pounding, as a woman described an encounter chillingly similar to my own, a voice calling for help, leading her deep into the woods, only to reveal something inhuman and terrifying. When she finished, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee cup, I found myself standing up. I saw something too, I began hesitantly. And then the words came pouring out, everything I'd experienced over those nightmarish days in the cabin. As I spoke, I saw recognition and understanding in the eyes of those around me. For the first time since my ordeal began, I felt truly heard and believed. After the meeting, several people approached me, offering words of support and sharing their own experiences. One man, a local historian, told me about the long history of strange occurrences in the area, dating back to Native American legends of spirits in the woods. As I left the community center that night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The horror of what I'd experienced was still with me, and I knew it always would be. But knowing I wasn't alone, that others had faced similar terrors and survived, gave me a strange sort of peace. In the days that followed, I grappled with what to do next. I couldn't bring myself to return to the cabin to retrieve my belongings, but I did file a report with the local authorities about my experience. They were skeptical, of course, but promised to look into it. I called my cousin from a payphone, relieved to hear his voice and confirm that he was safe. I gave him a sanitized version of events, telling him there had been some trouble at the cabin, and I'd had to leave suddenly. He was concerned and apologetic, but I assured him it wasn't his fault. As for my writing career, well, I finally had a story to tell. Not the novel I'd originally planned, but something far stranger and more terrifying. I began to write, pouring my experiences onto the page, turning my nightmare into a narrative that I hoped might warn others about the dangers lurking in the dark heart of Pisgah. I'm not sure if anyone will believe my story. Most will probably dismiss it as fiction, a horror tale spun from an overactive imagination. But I know the truth, and I know that out there in the depths of the forest, something is waiting, watching, humming its otherworldly song. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the bustling streets of Brevard, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The paranoia began to eat away at me, making it difficult to sleep or concentrate on my writing. I started attending the support group meetings regularly, finding comfort in the shared experiences of others who had encountered the unexplainable. One evening, an elderly man named George approached me after the meeting. His eyes were kind but held a sadness that spoke of a lifetime of carrying a heavy burden. "I've been listening to your story, son," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "And I think it's time I shared mine with you. It might help you understand what you're dealing with." We walked to a nearby diner, and over cups of coffee that grew cold as we talked, George unfolded a tale that chilled me to the bone. He had been a forest ranger in Pisgah National Forest back in the 1970s, and during his time there, he had witnessed things that defied explanation. It wasn't just one incident, George explained, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. It was a series of strange occurrences over the years, animals behaving oddly, as if they were fleeing from some unseen predator, hikers going missing, only to turn up days later with no memory of where they'd been, and the sounds. God, the sounds. He described hearing unearthly wails echoing through the forest at night, sounds that no known animal could make. And then there were the lights, strange pulsating orbs that would appear deep in the woods, hovering just above the treetops before vanishing without a trace. "But the worst was the day I found the cave," George continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was hidden behind a waterfall, easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. Inside I found paintings, ancient paintings on the walls that seemed to depict things, creatures that looked almost human but not quite, and symbols, strange symbols that hurt your eyes to look at them for too long." George had reported his findings to his superiors, but they had dismissed his concerns. The cave was written off as an undocumented Native American site, and George was warned not to spread crazy stories that might scare off tourists. "But I knew what I saw," George said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "And I think you've seen it too, or something like it. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's been there for a long, long time, and it's not going anywhere." As I listened to George's story, pieces of my own experience began to fall into place. The strange symbols I'd seen carved into trees near the cabin, the inexplicable sense of dread that had permeated the air. It all suddenly felt like part of something much larger and more ancient than I had realized. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into research, spending long hours at the local library poring over historical records and folklore of the region. I discovered that the area had a long history of unexplained phenomena, dating back to the earliest European settlers and beyond. Native American legends spoke of a thin place in the forest, where the veil between worlds was weak, allowing spirits and otherworldly entities to cross over. As I delved deeper into my research, I began to notice strange occurrences in my daily life. Books I needed would fall off the shelf just as I reached for them. I'd overhear snippets of conversation that seemed eerily relevant to my investigation. And more than once, I could have sworn I saw the same figure watching me from across the street, only to disappear when I tried to get a closer look. One night, as I was walking back to my motel room after a late dinner, I felt an overwhelming sense of being followed. The street was deserted, the only sound the buzz of the street lights and the distant bark of a dog. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I reached for my room key, I heard a voice behind me, a voice that sounded exactly like my cousin's. "Hey, need some help?" I spun around, my blood turning to ice in my veins. There, standing under the flickering neon of the motel sign, was a figure that looked exactly like my cousin. But something was off. The smile was too wide, the eyes too blank. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice shaking. The thing that wasn't my cousin tilted its head at an impossible angle, its grin stretching even wider. "Are you sure about that?" it asked, its voice distorting into something inhuman. I fumbled with my key, practically falling into my room and slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, lights blazing, jumping at every sound. The next morning I called my cousin again just to hear his voice and reassure myself that he was okay. He answered, groggy with sleep, completely unaware of my terror. I didn't tell him about what I'd seen. How could I? As the weeks turned into months, I found myself at a crossroads. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from Pisgah and its mysteries as I could. But another part of me felt compelled to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind what was happening in these woods. I began to interview other locals, gathering more stories of strange encounters and unexplained events. Some were reluctant to talk at first, but once they realized I wasn't there to mock or dismiss them, the stories came pouring out. Tales of lost time, of strange creatures glimpsed in the underbrush, of voices calling out in the night. One story in particular stuck with me. An old woman, her face lined with years of hard living, told me about her grandfather's encounter back in the 1930s. He had been a moonshiner, operating a still deep in the woods to avoid the revenuers. One night, as he was tending to his still, he heard music, beautiful otherworldly music that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He said it was like nothing he'd ever heard before, the old woman recounted, her eyes distant with memory. It made him want to follow it, to find its source, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was common sense, but he packed up his still that very night and never went back into those woods again. As I collected these stories, a pattern began to emerge. The encounters seemed to cluster around certain areas of the forest, particularly in the more remote regions where few people ventured. I started mapping out the incidents, creating a web of strangeness that spread across Pisgah like a spider's web. My research led me to an old, nearly forgotten legend about a place deep in the forest known as the Whisper Hollow. According to the stories, it was a place where the boundaries between our world and something else were thin. A place where reality itself seemed to warp and bend. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the Whisper Hollow was the key to understanding what was happening in Pisgah. But finding it wouldn't be easy. The location was shrouded in mystery, with different stories placing it in different parts of the vast forest. I knew I was taking a risk by even considering going back into those woods. The memory of my terrifying experience at the cabin was still fresh in my mind. But I also knew that I would never find peace until I uncovered the truth. So I began to prepare. I bought hiking gear, studied maps of the forest, and even took a wilderness survival course. I also reached out to some of the people I'd met through the support group, asking if anyone would be willing to accompany me on my search for the Whisper Hollow. To my surprise, 3 people volunteered. Maria, a retired teacher who had her own strange encounter in the woods years ago, Dave, a local carpenter with a passion for cryptozoology, and Laura, a young graduate student studying folklore, who was eager to see if there was any truth to the legends. As we planned our expedition, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once I caught glimpses of strange shadows moving at the edge of my vision, or heard whispers just on the edge of hearing. But I tried to push these fears aside, focusing instead on our preparations. The night before we were set to leave, I had a vivid dream. I was standing in a forest clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to loom impossibly tall. In the center of the clearing was a pool of water, so still it looked like black glass. As I approached the pool, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. The face looking back at me was ancient, its features constantly shifting and changing. I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream lingering like a bad taste in my mouth. As I got ready to meet the others, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step into something far beyond our understanding. Our journey into Pisgah began on a crisp autumn morning, the trees a riot of red and gold. We had decided to start our search in an area where several of the stories I'd collected seemed to overlap. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of birds and small animals gradually faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. By the third day of our expedition, we had ventured far off the marked trails, relying on our map and compass to navigate the increasingly dense forest. The air felt thick and heavy, as if we were walking through an invisible fog. Maria was the first to notice that our compasses were acting strangely, the needles spinning erratically before settling on a direction that couldn't possibly be north. "I don't like this," Dave muttered, eyeing the surrounding trees warily. "It feels like the forest is watching us." I knew exactly what he meant. There was a palpable sense of unease that seemed to seep from the very ground we walked on. More than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain that I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision. As night fell, we set up camp in a small clearing. The darkness seemed to press in around us, our campfire creating a small island of light in an ocean of shadows. We took turns keeping watch, none of us willing to leave ourselves completely vulnerable to whatever might be out there. It was during my watch in the darkest hours of the night that I first heard it, a faint melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was hauntingly beautiful, and I found myself straining to hear it more clearly. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, not wanting to wake the others if it was just my imagination. But Laura was already sitting up in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide. "I hear it," she said softly. It's like nothing I've ever heard before." As we listened, the humming grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be calling to us, urging us to follow it deeper into the woods. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to get up and walk towards the sound, and I could see the same struggle reflected in Laura's face. Suddenly, Maria bolted upright with a gasp. "No!" she cried out, her voice thick with terror. "Don't listen to it! That's how they get you!" Her shout broke whatever spell the music had cast over us. The humming faded away, leaving behind in silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. None of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning as we broke camp, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. We all knew that we had experienced something beyond the ordinary, something that couldn't be easily explained away. "Maybe we should turn back," Dave suggested, his usual enthusiasm noticeably dampened. "We're clearly dealing with forces we don't understand." Part of me agreed with him. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But another part, the part that had been driving me since that night at the cabin, knew that I couldn't turn back now. We were close to something. I could feel it. "We press on," I said, trying to inject more confidence into my voice than I felt. "We came here for answers, and I intend to find them." As we continued our journey, the forest around us seemed to change subtly. The trees grew larger, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. Strange fungi in colors I had never seen before sprouted from the ground and the bark of trees. The air became thick with a sweet, cloying scent that made my head spin. It was Laura who first noticed the symbols. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak, partially obscured by moss and lichen, was a series of intricate designs that looked vaguely like writing, but in no alphabet any of us recognized. "These symbols," Laura breathed, her fingers tracing the carvings. "They're similar to ones found in some ancient Native American sites, but different. Older, somehow." As we examined the tree more closely, we realized that the symbols weren't just on this one tree. They were everywhere. Once we knew what to look for, we could see them carved into rocks, formed by the patterns of lichen on tree trunks, even seemingly drawn in the very soil beneath our feet. "It's like the whole forest is trying to tell us something," Maria said, her voice hushed with awe and fear. We spent hours documenting the symbols, Laura sketching them in her notebook while I took photographs. The more we looked, the more we found, and soon we realized that the symbols seemed to be forming a path, leading us deeper into the heart of the forest. As we followed this cryptic trail, the world around us seemed to shift and change. Colors became more vibrant, almost painfully so. Shadows moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. More than once I saw things moving just at the edge of my vision, shapes that were almost human, but not quite. The air grew thick with mist, limiting our visibility to just a few feet ahead. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, whispers in a language none of us understood, the cry of birds that shouldn't exist, and always faintly in the background, that haunting melodic humming. We lost all sense of time as we pressed on. Our watches had stopped working, and the sky above was hidden by a thick canopy of leaves. It could have been hours or days that we walked following the trail of symbols. Finally, we emerged from the mist into a vast clearing. In the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk easily 30 feet in diameter. The bark was covered in the same strange symbols we had been following, but here they seemed to glow with an inner light. At the base of the tree was a pool of water so still it looked like a mirror. The surface reflected not the sky above, but what looked like another forest, a dark, twisted version of the one we stood in. "The Whisper Hollow," I breathed, knowing without a doubt that we had found what we were looking for. As we approached the pool, the humming we had heard earlier grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the water itself, calling to us, inviting us closer. Dave reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the pool. "What do you think happens if we touch it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before any of us could answer, a voice spoke from behind us, a voice that sounded like rustling leaves and creaking wood, ancient and powerful. "You have come seeking answers," it said, "but are you prepared for the truth?" We turned, and there, emerging from the mist, was a figure that defied description. It seemed to be made of bark and leaves, its form constantly shifting and changing. Eyes like amber pools regarded us with an intelligence that was decidedly not human. "What are you?" Maria gasped, her voice trembling. The being's mouth, if you could call it that, curved into what might have been a smile. "I am the guardian of this place," it said, "the keeper of the boundary between your world and others." As it spoke, the world around us seemed to ripple and shift. I saw glimpses of other realities, worlds of impossible beauty and terrifying darkness, all layered over our own like a complex tapestry. "The veil is thin here," the Guardian continued. "What you have experienced, what you have seen in these woods, they are but echoes of what lies beyond. Your kind is not meant to walk between worlds, yet some are drawn here, pulled by forces they cannot understand." I thought of all the stories I had collected, all the strange encounters and inexplicable events. "The missing hikers," I said, "the strange creatures people have seen." The Guardian nodded, a slow creaking movement. "Some find their way back, others do not." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the full implications of what we had stumbled upon. This wasn't just about solving a mystery or uncovering a local legend. We were standing at the threshold of something far greater, far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. "Why show yourself to us now?" Laura asked, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. The Guardian's form shifted, branches and leaves rearranging themselves into a new configuration. "Because you sought. because you listened. And because the balance is shifting. The boundary grows weaker and what lies beyond grows restless. As if in response to its words, the humming from the pool grew louder, more insistent. The surface of the water began to ripple, and I could have sworn I saw shapes moving beneath its surface. Things that should not, could not exist in our world. You stand at a crossroads, the Guardian said, its voice taking on an urgent tone. What you do with the knowledge you have gained here will shape the future of both your world and others. Choose wisely. With those words, the Guardian began to fade, its form dissolving back into the mist. The humming from the pool reached a fever pitch, and the world around us seemed to waver, as if reality itself was uncertain. In that moment, I knew we had a choice to make. We could turn back, try to forget what we had seen and return to our normal lives. Or we could step forward into the unknown, risking everything to uncover the full truth of what lay beyond the Whisper Hollow. As I looked at my companions, I saw the same mixture of fear and determination in their eyes that I felt in my own heart. Whatever we decided, I knew that our lives would never be the same again. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting for our decision. The fate of two worlds, perhaps more, hung in the balance. And as the mist swirled around us and the otherworldly music filled the air, I took a deep breath and made my choice. We need to seal it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't let whatever's on the other side come through. Maria nodded, her face set with determination. But how? As if in answer, I felt a weight in my pocket. Reaching in, I pulled out a small, smooth stone, one I didn't remember picking up. It was covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen throughout the forest. Instinctively, I knew what I had to do. I approached the pool, the humming growing almost unbearable. The surface rippled violently, shapes just beneath trying to break through. With a silent prayer, I dropped the stone into the center of the pool. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The humming turned into a shriek that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The pool's surface began to churn and boil, the shapes beneath thrashing in what looked like agony. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Laura's arm and pulling her away from the pool. We fled through the forest, the world around us seeming to warp and twist. Trees bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching for us like grasping hands. The ground beneath our feet shifted and roiled, making each step a struggle. Behind us, a sound like reality itself tearing apart filled the air. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other, on getting as far away from that clearing as possible. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been hours or days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that otherworldly forest. But gradually the sounds of pursuit faded. The trees around us began to look more normal, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Finally, exhausted and gasping for breath, we stumbled onto a hiking trail. In the distance, we could hear the faint sounds of traffic, civilization. We looked at each other, our faces dirty and scratched, our clothes torn. No words were needed. We all knew that what we had experienced would stay with us forever. As we made our way back to town, I thought about everything we had seen and learned. The Guardian's warning echoed in my mind. The balance is shifting. The boundary grows weaker. I knew then that our work wasn't over. We had closed one doorway, but how many others were out there? How many other thin places existed where the veil between worlds could be breached? In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to readjust to normal life. But the memory of our experience in Pisgah haunted us. We stayed in touch, sharing our research and keeping an eye out for any signs that the boundary might be weakening again. I continued my writing, but not the novel I had originally planned. Instead, I began documenting our experiences, encrypting the most sensitive information. I scattered clues throughout my work, breadcrumbs for those who might need this knowledge in the future. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that haunting melody. I see shadows move in ways they shouldn't. And I wonder if we truly succeeded in sealing the breach, or if we only delayed the inevitable. One thing I know for certain, the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. There are forces out there beyond our understanding, entities that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And somewhere, In the depths of Pisgah National Forest, the Whisper Hollow waits. Silent for now, but for how long? Only time will tell. As for me, I'll keep watching, keep listening. Because now I know the truth. The veil is thin, and what lies beyond is always trying to find a way through. And when it does, someone needs to be ready to face it. That someone might just be me.